So we're continuing on at the moment with Gothic architecture in France. And from my last little video I made for you, I pointed out one of the main things to think about when you're thinking of the difference between the Romanesque and the Gothic is that they go from the rounded arch to the pointed arch. It is, in my opinion, the easiest way to tell the two architectural styles apart. But there are some other things that are very different between the two that we will be looking at and are also listed in the first video I have up in Blackboard. So if we look at the elements of architecture, we have our ribbed vaulting. And if you remember, we had the groin vault, which was the in the Romanesque style, it was the two rounded arches that are coming together. So now we're pointing the arch, and with the pointed arch we have these ribs that are helping to connect these two parts of the ceiling and become a very prominent decorative element within the architecture. So our next church or cathedral, I should say actually, that we are going to look at is also not too far from Paris, and it is known as Chartres Cathedral in France, and it is circa 1200 to 1210. And here I'm showing you one of the stained glass windows, and it has the scenes from Genesis, which is the very beginning of the Bible. So we have, like the creation of Adam and Eve, and these stories that are being depicted in this window. And again, this is the technique of the enamel painting that I talked about in my last video. And we can look at the west facade of the cathedral, and this is 1145 approximately to 1155, and I have a number of smart history videos up about this cathedral that I would like you to go into Blackboard and make sure you're watching. But one thing I do want to point out, focus in on, are these the jambs that are these statues. They're like pillars, really, and they are on the central west door of the cathedral. And we begin to see a transition in style that happens with this cathedral and moving forward from our Romanesque into our really Gothic style. So when we look at these figures, you should notice that they're very linear. They're very, like very thin, narrow figures. They don't break away from the shape of the column that they're attached to. Really, they kind of just are morphed into that column. So they're not very realistic in any way. They almost look, when you look at the feet, it almost looks as though they're hung on the side of the building. We don't have realistic faces. In fact, the smiles on them or the smirks, or whatever you want to call them, are almost exactly the same. We don't have any kind of, if you remember the term contrapposto, this comes from, I hope you remember, the Greeks and to the Romans, and it was a way of shifting the weight on the body, a very natural way of showing the body. And if you remember, we've been talking about this now for weeks, that we have far moved away from that, and we really moved away from a realistic depiction of the human body, again, throughout the word, iconoclasm. So it was this belief that you really shouldn't be showing the human form realistic in a religious setting. And the compromise was, some people were saying no human forms, and other people wanted the human form. So the compromise was to have a human form that is out of proportion, purposefully. We're not having any realistic depiction of the human form because we're not trying to replicate the world around us anymore. But now we're having a shift back to wanting to replicate the world. We'll begin to see that because, again, they go back with the Crusades, and they're going back and they're starting to look at the Greeks and the Romans again from antiquity. They're beginning to look at that. They're beginning to look at Aristotle. They want reason now. They don't want this unquestionable faith in God. So we really will see how this alters the artwork. When we look at the cathedral from above, we can see that the main nave here is quite large. And this section that goes across is called the transept. In other cathedrals, we'll see that this gets pulled out more so that the building itself really takes on the shape of a cross to be the real true representation, they think, of the religion. And as I have pointed out before, we have the ambulatory, which brings you around the whole building. We have our chapels up here where we're going to have relics. So these things become quite standard, even though maybe the proportions of the building change from one building to the next. Certain things become extremely standardized in these churches. So now we're looking at the interior view looking east down the church, and you could see one thing right away, the ribbed vaults. So we see, I showed you in the slide just a minute ago, how this ribbing really becomes a key decorative element within the ceiling, and you can see it really takes on that point of the Gothic. You can see here, this is pointed. We can see the ambulatory. So all the opening up more of the windows here, the stained glass, allowing for the ceiling to be higher and more glass, more windows, more light, more of an open airy space within the structure. So the interesting thing is that this cathedral, what happened was it was a Romanesque cathedral, but it burnt. It burnt to the ground, except for this one spire. This one section here in the front was saved. And the story goes that there was the relic of this tunic that Mary had worn, and everyone thought that when the church burnt, this relic was lost, and this would be a big tragedy for the church because the relics, as I've said, well, one, it's just the symbolic religious aspect of it for the people, but then also to have the relic was important because it meant that you could get people to come to the church. It meant money for the church. It meant money for the town, because of course when you went to the church, then you would stay in the town, you need somewhere to sleep, you need food to eat. So these were money makers for these towns. But then as they're cleaning up from the fire, they found the tunic and it was saved. And it was supposedly a miracle. So the church gets rebuilt, or the cathedral gets rebuilt, but they leave this section, which was Romanesque, and then they incorporate this new Gothic style. So you'll see that the other spire is in the Gothic. The tower here is in the Gothic style, right? And the church itself is in the Gothic style, but this tower and spire are in the Romanesque. Another thing to point out that you can see in this schematic drawing are the flying buttresses. So these are another element of the Gothic that we don't see in the Romanesque. In the Romanesque, the buttress is right up against the wall. It's helping to support the arch. But in the Gothic, they take the buttress and they separate it out to bring the thrust of the arch outward and down into the ground. And this becomes an architectural element that's really holding the roof up. The walls are not holding the roof up anymore. And this is how they're able to make these large windows like this one, like a rose window here in the front. And one other element that we'll see is the fact that the columns inside the church get thinner and thinner, and it has this more slender kind of uplifting aspect to to it as the ceilings get higher in the Gothic. And here's the beautiful rose window in the cathedral. And when you stand in one of these cathedrals, you have to remember that when these were built, there's no electric light at the time. So these would have been illuminated by candlelight. But even if you ever get to go in one of these, it's usually the lights are fairly dim inside. So if you stand and you face the window here and you stare at the window and you let your eyes adjust to the dim light inside the cathedral, you have a sense that the wall kind of disappears and this is just floating there in space. And it's quite breathtaking to have this, and this concept then of like literally like the light of God coming through the windows here and through the stained glass, and all of them having biblical stories from the Bible. So, you know, even if you're not Catholic and you go to a cathedral like this and you're looking at it, just visually, it is really stunning and, in my opinion, quite moving. And here we see that the rose window, it really floats above what are called the lancet windows. The shape of it is what's giving the name the lancet window. And these are glorifying the Virgin Mary. Okay, so we are going to stop this and pick it up again with another one of the cathedrals.